Hey everyone, so today we'll actually be talking about something a little basic, but something that's extremely useful and that every filmmaker should really have in their toolkit, whether they're out in the field or in the studio. So as cameras start to get more powerful and cheaper and filmmaking becomes more accessible in general, we're starting to see this push towards a new innovation. Things like cheaper gimbals, newer smartphone applications, and better hardware is already coming out and being the top priority for a lot of filmmakers these days. So I know you've actually been in this situation before where you want to shoot maybe in broad daylight with your lens completely wide open or at a specific aperture, but unfortunately there's too much light coming in and hitting the sensor. The biggest issue I see with novice filmmakers is that they'll either crank down the ISO and find that they can't get the camera dark enough, and then they'll actually start to crank the shutter speed down. And this ends up going against the 180-degree shutter rule and destroying your motion blur and fluid movement. If you don't know what the 180-degree shutter rule is, that's fine. I'll actually be doing a video about it sometime in the near future. The short of it is you basically want to keep your shutter speed double your frame rate that you're shooting at. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you'll want to shoot at 1/48. If you're shooting at 60 frames a second, you'll want to shoot at 1/120th, for instance. Now, in order to alleviate this issue, you can get a series of ND filters, either static or variable. Static ND filters are exactly what they sound like. They come in specific stops that reduce the amount of light that hits the sensor. In order to achieve the best exposure, you can stack these ND filters or you can just put one on and adjust accordingly. The second form factor, and the one I recommend, is a variable ND filter. The most common form factor that you'll see of which is a screw-on thread that goes on the front of your lens element and then has a front dial that allows you to manually adjust how much light comes in. There are also other form factors for these that you might see in the field, such as slide-in ND filters that can go in a matte box for higher-end productions, or variable NDs that are electronic and built into the camera itself. Higher-end cinema cameras such as the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro or Sony FS5 have built-in electronic ND filters that sit in between the glass and the sensor and the rear lens element. Now, what are the use case scenarios for something like this? Well, as we spoke of earlier, there's three common ones I want to talk about. Number one, you want to shoot completely wide open with your brand new prime lens and you want to have beautiful isolation and bokeh from the background and your subject. A variable ND filter, for instance, would allow you to maintain the perfect 180-degree shutter rule and shoot at a low ISO, reducing noise. Not only that, but should you need to re-expose out in the field, variable ND filters are gradual, unlike aperture changes in camera, which are more jarring when shifted. Pretty much all lenses have a specific aperture range where they're most sharp and where they have reduced chromatic aberration. If you look online at a variety of different resources, you'll be able to find which aperture range is best for your lens. The biggest issue with stopping down, for instance, something like f/22 in broad daylight, is if you imagine it like your eye and you try and squint as hard as possible, you'll actually lose detail and sharpness when doing so. This would allow you to shoot at the most ideal aperture range on your camera lens where the image quality is at its best. That way you don't have to worry about readjusting each time, and if you can't stop down enough, you can just decrease the amount of light hitting the sensor by turning the dial on your filter. Or number three, there's just simply too much light hitting the sensor. A lot of videographers or even photographers, for instance, run into situations where there's simply just too much light in the scene. Say you're shooting a video of a furnace or an eclipse or welding. Each one of these situations, there's too much light hitting the sensor and you simply just need to reduce it. So this is where a static or variable ND filter would come into play. It would actually allow you to reduce as much light as you desire and even sometimes prevent damage to the sensor from too much focused light hitting it. Now, the biggest disadvantage of using ND filters comes with the fact that you're adding more glass in front of your lens. Ultimately, you'll see certain things appear in your image later in post, and depending on the quality of your ND filter, these can be more apparent than others. One of the most obvious things you'll probably notice is a color shift. In this image example where I've taken some static shots on a tripod with my Ursa Mini, you'll see that there's a slight green shift with the ND filter and a slight loss of sharpness. Or for instance, if you need to crank down the shutter speed to actually compensate for the amount of light coming in, you'll notice that the motion comes in jagged and not fluid. So those are the reasons that you should look into investing in an ND filter system. You'll be able to shoot wide open and maintain that beautiful bokeh, but also be able to have the 180-degree shutter rule and reduce noise by lowering your ISO. You'll also be able to have a more gradual light change when re-exposing and not have to deal with the jarring effects that come with clicked aperture changes in camera. And if it ultimately comes down to it, you'll prevent damage to your sensor from too much light hitting it. Now, my recommendation is to look at the largest lens you have that still has a filter, not something like a fisheye where you'd need a slot-in ND filter. find whatever filter size that is and buy an ND filter for that one. Later down the line, you can just buy step-up rings and then adjust accordingly for your smaller lenses. This way you only have to invest in one large ND filter that you can use across all of your lenses out in the field. So go ahead and look in the description below for the ND filter that we used in this video and a step-up ring kit allowing you to use that ND filter across all of your lenses.